Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the finances behind consolidations in higher education. So first, a little bit of background. Consolidations and mergers are called many things. Basically, it's two or more institutions coming together to form a single entity. And in the literature, the terms consolidation or merger are the most common because they're the most innocuous. So acquisitions are often presented as consolidations because the emphasis is then placed on the idea of partners of equal standing coming together. So it's just more neutral than terms like takeover or acquisition. Mergers are common in other industries. Typically when demand drops, a consolidation will usually follow. But higher education has been immune to this for a long time, primarily because it's so heavily regulated and subsidized, but mounting fiscal problems are changing this. For example, in small universities, so less than 1,000 full-time equivalent students, administrative costs are twice that of universities with 2,000 or more students. So small institutions in particular are looking at means of cutting costs, and merger is one of those routes. Some of the considerations that institutions need to keep in mind, they need to be clear about their motives and goals, whether it's diversity or efficiency. And in this case, diversity refers to institutional diversity, so programs and services. These two terms are often mutually exclusive, and administrators need to understand that and decide which one has the priority, because they tend to have an inverse relationship. If you're increasing your efficiency, you're losing some of your diversity, vice versa. Culturally sensitive management is also key. Keeping in mind the culture and history and traditions of both institutions. Transformational leadership is critically important both during and after the merger. It helps generate intrinsic commitment among the staff and translates their self-interest into something that benefits the wider goal of the new institution. Timing is also very important. Institutions should consider timing of things like tuition and fee increases, student recruitment, any other major changes that will contribute to uncertainty, and try to work around those things as best as possible. Institutions really have to focus on convincing potential students to invest a pretty significant portion of their future earnings in studying at this new institution that has a new name and has a brand identity that's yet to be established. So next we'll look at some of the types of merger. There's typically 4 categories, and they sit along a continuum from organizational rescue, so some of the smaller institutions looking for help or institutions that are in financial trouble. Moving along the continuum, we have kind of the ideal collaborative merger. Both parties are ready and willing. And then we move to contested combination. And then last is a raid, which I'm not sure we see very often in higher education. I think that's more of a corporate thing, and obviously a place we want to avoid. The main reason is typically financial, promoting efficiency in production and ensuring optimal allocation of resources, essentially realizing economies of scale, so reduction of inputs without reducing the level of output. Some mergers fail because this concept is poorly understood, and some fail just because the partners were incompatible. Larger institutions often merge with smaller institutions to increase their diversity at a lower cost, especially if the smaller institution is financially struggling. So essentially the larger institution is buying new programs at the cost of the other institution's debt. There's also sometimes the motivation to form monopolies through merger so that institutions can secure and control resources and protect them from competition. There's also the hope that mergers create new alignments in research, education, and innovation in response to global competitiveness. And this also assists with recruitment of the most talented faculty and researchers. And there's an idea that mergers will reduce the overall number of institutions, so therefore the cost of higher education system will be reduced. But mergers are pretty costly, and I think that savings is often overestimated. So some of the benefits of mergers, why are we doing this? Mergers are often seen as kind of a magic bullet to fix all institutional troubles, but the outcomes are not easy to verify, so we're not really sure if that's the case. Another benefit is realizing economies of scale, mainly due to the number of administrators decreasing. So eliminating duplicative positions, you only need one set of VPs for an institution. And the idea that two can live as cheaply as one. And then some of the challenges, first is geographical distance. If the institutions are really far apart, that's going to have an impact on the merger and how well it works. And often it's underestimated how time-consuming and resource-intensive mergers are. And staff and students have a tendency to see mergers as threatening to the institutional strengths and traditions and culture. And so that needs to be addressed as well in the merger. Otherwise, it can lead to a decrease in morale or a loss of institutional identity. So the cost savings are kind of in question because they're new costs from a multi-site institution, and many cost centers are fixed. So things like libraries, information systems, building depreciation and maintenance, all those essentially just get added together in a new budget. So any economy of scale savings doesn't apply to those costs. It just applies to the subset of the budget that's not fixed, and that can be as low as 50% of the total budget. And also, economies of scale are not realized if enrollment is less than 9,000 or greater than 20,000. So ideally, you want the two merging institutions to be inside that window. Also, it's hard to define what success means in a merger. There's really a lack of relevant data, particularly for the United States. Results can take up to 10 years to manifest themselves, and that's a long time to study an institution. And really, outside researchers are rarely welcome to the process because there is usually some level of secrecy, and administrators may not want that exposed. It's also difficult to separate merger from other effects. So things like a declining economy, for example, it's hard to determine what's impacting the institution more. It's hard to tease those apart. And success depends on the reason for merging in the first place. Again, it goes back to that diversity or efficiency idea, because they often offset one another. So efficiency kind of discourages competition or diversity. And this is one of the big growing dilemmas in higher education, is which is more important to higher education? Is it more important to have institutional diversity or efficiency? So let's take a look at some of the current evidence. In the corporate world, more than half fail or have negative impacts on productivity, and relatively few deliver what they promised. But higher education mergers shouldn't be viewed as business deals, because if you do so, you'll lose sight of culture and mission, potentially causing the merger to fail. So fundamentally, higher education mergers are just different from corporate mergers. An analysis of Norwegian mergers, these have been ongoing for a long time, so there's been plenty of time to sort of analyze the impact here. There have been no significant economies of scale realized with regard to the number of administrators, because while they eliminated some duplicated positions, the overall number of administrators didn't change, so some were added. It's also, they found it's more expensive to run a network institution rather than a single campus, and in part because of traveling costs between campuses. At the time of the study, economic limitations reduced traveling, which then has consequences for relationships between personnel. Also, economies of scale were not realized because duplicative courses couldn't be eliminated. They were needed on both campuses. And that happened in other aspects as well, particularly because some of the campuses were so far apart, there really wasn't a lot of duplication that could be eliminated. And in Australian mergers, these have been going on for decades. The government found that there were some short-term savings realized, but really that was just because declining enrollment led to a tightened budget. So expenditures were cut because they had to be. So again, there's that tie-in between the effects of the merger and some other outside effects, and which one had a greater impact. So overall, the savings they found in Australian mergers were pretty minimal because any gains from eliminated positions were then funneled back into student services. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but the overall expenditures remained relatively the same. And access to higher education was expanded, but diversity was lost because the overall number of institutions decreased. So some of the future directions, it's really important to consider the resource allocation model. It must take into consideration the history, culture, and configuration of the new university. Otherwise, power struggles result. The model must also retain sufficient central funds, and that will encourage cooperation across budget lines to fund strategic initiatives that benefit the new institution as a whole. And it's important to keep in mind that status and efficiency may be improved, but at the expense of academic and scholarly development. Although more mergers survive than not, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're universally recommended. The move towards mergers is slowing in some jurisdictions as that relationship between efficiency and diversity is realized. If diversification is the main goal, then mergers probably don't make sense because there are other means of cooperation that are less final and don't cause that loss of culture and identity. Costs may rise if the new institution is too complex, so that's something administrators need to keep in mind. And mergers will remain important for smaller institutions seeking out larger institutions. So the bottom line here is that we may be running out of mergers to make. They may be evolving into the creation of mini systems rather than single institutions. That's already occurring in the Netherlands and Australia. We also may see more responsibility-centered budgeting. So that shifts the decision-making ability to individual units. They generate their own revenue and pay for their own expenditures, but then also pay a tax to the central office to cover units that can't generate their own revenue. That type of budgeting makes sense for institutions with multiple campuses, and that may become more common in the future. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Please let me know if you have any questions, and have a great day.